At a quiet desert truck stop, an old man and his leashed dog sat silently in a diner booth, just like they always did. But when 3 loud bikers mocked the dog, then kicked it outside while it was tied up, they had no idea what kind of animal they were provoking. Because this wasn't just a pet. It was a retired military canine. And when the man gave a single word, the dog responded with years of precision training and a level of discipline they'd never seen coming. What happened next turned the whole town into silent witnesses and left the bikers changed forever. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when the light began to stretch across the cracked asphalt of the truck stop at mile marker 73. It was the kind of place that didn't show up on tourist maps or GPS apps. One pump leaned slightly to the left. The ice machine outside buzzed louder than it cooled. Flyers for lost dogs, trucker for higher numbers, and discount tire rotations clung to the window of the diner, edges curled and bleached from months of desert sun. It wasn't a destination, just a spot where engines cooled, coffee poured, and people passed through without leaving much behind. Inside the diner, the floor tiles were worn down to the concrete in places, and the vinyl on the booths had cracked long ago, now patched with duct tape in muted colors. Cassie, the morning waitress, was already moving with her usual rhythm refilling sugar caddies, checking the creamer rotation and warming the coffee pot with a half-listening ear to the local radio behind the counter. A trucker with a CB radio headset sat hunched at the end of the counter, scribbling route notes in a logbook that smelled faintly of diesel and cigarette ash. The bell above the door jingled, slow and uneven. Red walked in like he always did, deliberate steps, not slow, but not rushed either. He wore a sun-faded brown flannel over a tan shirt tucked into jeans that had long lost their blue. His boots weren't polished, but they were clean. The dog beside him matched his pace with eerie precision, a large, muscular German shepherd with a dark sable coat and focused amber eyes. The leash between them was barely taut. The dog didn't sniff, didn't tug, didn't bark, just walked in, surveyed the space like it had seen it 100 times, and sat beside the corner booth without waiting for instruction. Cassie nodded at Red. Usual, he gave one slight nod, then slid into the booth with the ease of someone whose bones had taken a few beatings, but still knew how to carry him. The dog didn't climb in or lie down. It sat still as stone, eyes tracking only the movement of Red's hand as he reached for the menu, though he didn't need it. The dog's harness was black, nondescript, with no patches or visible insignia. But there was a weight to its stitched-in experience, maybe. Something about the stillness that hinted at restraint, not ignorance. Outside, the wind kicked up fine. Dust that rattled across the lot. A stray paper cup danced against the curb before spinning away toward the scrub brush at the edge of the parking area. The only other vehicle was an old Ford pickup parked at the side of the building, sun-faded and missing a hubcap, with a camper shell bolted down to the truck bed. A crate of water jugs and a worn sleeping bag sat inside, neatly stacked. A few states away, it might have drawn comment. Here, it was invisible. Red poured a small measure of creamer into his coffee and stirred without clinking the spoon against the ceramic. The sound of the radio shifted to static, then back to a voice reading the day's temperatures. Highs near 102, nothing unusual. Cassie brought over a plate with over-easy eggs, dry wheat toast, and a side of hash browns. She set it down without a word, then crouched slightly to eye the dog. "Good morning, Shadow," she said softly. The dog blinked once, didn't move. That was answer enough. Red didn't talk much. Most folks who passed through assumed he was mute or antisocial, but those who came, often enough troopers with repeat routes, highway patrol officers, a few traveling repair crews, knew he just chose his words like tools, carefully, only when needed. Shadow had been with him as long as anyone could remember. Some said the dog was a former military canine. Others guessed police or rescue. Red never said, but people noticed things. How the dog never sniffed the floor for scraps, how it ignored other animals, how its ears perked at distant sounds before anyone else reacted, and how it never left Red's side, not once. The quiet was broken only by the sizzle of bacon in the kitchen and the low rumble of a rig pulling off the highway in the distance. The lot outside remained still. No raised voices, no conflict. Just another quiet morning at a forgotten stop where nothing ever really happened. At least, not yet. The booth near the corner window was always his. No one had ever said it out loud, but regulars just knew not to sit there. The view wasn't particularly remarkable, just the flat stretch of dusty highway running off toward the horizon, a few tired shrubs, and the aging gas pumps that looked more ornamental than functional. But he preferred it. The sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin stripes, landing across the red vinyl seats and catching the steam rising from his black coffee. He stirred the mug once, and then left the spoon on the saucer. The eggs were always the same over, easy yolks just soft enough, and the toast dry with no butter. A jar of red pepper flakes sat on the table, though it was unclear if he ever used it. Everything about him seemed deliberate, as though even the simplest parts of his morning had been rehearsed until they became ritual. His face carried the lines of time. Spent outdoors creased from sun and wind, not from smiling. A beard that had once been dark was now mostly gray, trimmed neatly but not obsessively. His eyes were the kind that didn't wander much, staying mostly down or focused on something straight ahead. The hands that held the fork had calluses and sunspots, the sort of marks that didn't come from office work or soft labor. When he moved, there was no hesitation. But also no waste, just the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned, probably the hard way, how to do everything with half the motion and twice the purpose. The dog sat next to the booth, leashed, but not because it needed to be. The leash was a formality, the way a wedding ring says what words don't need to. Its name was Shadow, and the name fit, dark-furred, nearly black, save for a faint sable undertone visible only in direct light. Its ears remained upright, eyes forward, posture unmoving. It didn't beg or shift or even blink much. The other customers had stopped being startled by it long ago, but new ones always did a double take when they saw how still the animal sat. Like some old statue placed there with intention. Most dogs relax when their humans sit. They flop onto the floor, sniff for crumbs, maybe sigh and stretch. Shadow didn't it? Sat, spine straight, head forward, as if awaiting a command that might come at any time. There was tension in the stillness, not nervousness, but readiness, as if whatever instincts had been trained into it were always humming. Just under the surface, the man didn't speak, not to the waitress, not to the trucker, 2 booths over, not to the teenage boy sweeping near the entrance. A nod was all anyone got, and even that was reserved for things that earned acknowledgement. When the plate came, he raised one hand without looking, and Cassie set the food down like she was laying an offering before an altar. She never asked questions. She knew better. Every so often, someone new would stop in and try to start a conversation. Ask about the dog, where it was from, what it could do. Red would either not answer or say something so brief it didn't invite follow-up. "He's trained," was the most common response, and it was always said without inflection. Occasionally, someone asked what kind of training. He never elaborated. The dog didn't eat scraps from the table. There was a water dish outside the door, placed by the staff long ago, but Shadow rarely needed it. Red brought his own water bottle for the dog, always poured from the same beat-up thermos, never from a plastic bowl left by strangers. There was something about the two of them that didn't quite fit anywhere. They weren't hostile, but they weren't part of the rhythm either. They were more like fixtures objects, anchored by time rather than choice. They came early, sat alone, and left without ceremony. No conversation, no rush, just the quiet. Procession of coffee, eggs, and unspoken understanding. Most people eventually stopped noticing them, but the ones who did really noticed felt something they couldn't name. A kind of silence that carried weight. A presence that suggested both history and warning. And always, always the sense that the man in the booth and the dog beside him were waiting not idly, but with purpose, waiting for something only they would recognize when it came. Nobody really knew his full name. On paperwork, maybe, or a license buried deep in a wallet he never showed. But around town at the diner, at the post office, where he rarely picked up mail, or at the bait shop just off Highway 14, he was simply Red. Not for his hair, which had long since gone silver gray, but for the old patch on a jacket he used to wear. A faded insignia with a red stripe no one could quite place. Military, most thought. Probably army, maybe something else. He'd been around for over a decade by the time people started really asking about him. Lived in a trailer parked on the edge of a dried-up creek bed, maybe 2 miles off the main road. No mailbox. No electricity besides a solar rig he'd set up himself. Had a propane tank and a small water drum. Never asked for help. Never offered complaints. He bought canned food, jerky, coffee, and batteries. Never alcohol. Not even once. People in town remembered when he first arrived back, when the diner still had a jukebox and the gas. Pumps hadn't been updated in 30 years. He had pulled in driving an old Chevy Suburban that rattled more than it rolled. No plates from any state people recognized, just a temporary tag faded from sun exposure. He'd walked in, ordered coffee and eggs, paid in cash, and said exactly 2 words the entire morning: "Thank you." Over the years, little details trickled out, mostly through observation. He walked like someone trained to be aware of every corner of a room. His eyes moved differently, not nervous, just measured. One of the old-timers at the VFW swore he recognized the gate. Said red was former something, though he never clarified what that meant. Said men like him don't talk because they've already seen more than they care to explain. Cassie remembered a night during monsoon season years ago when the highway flooded. She and the night cook had been closing up early, watching the road rise with muddy runoff. Out of nowhere, Red had appeared, soaked through but calm, knocking twice on the diner's back door. He'd carried a teenage girl in his arms, one of the local rancher's kids, who had driven her father's truck straight into a washout. He didn't say a word, just handed the girl over and disappeared back into the storm. The next morning, he was back in his usual booth, drinking black coffee like nothing had happened. Shadow had been with him from the start. At first, folks assumed the dog was new, maybe rescued. But as time went on, it became clear that the two had a rhythm that wasn't learned overnight. The way Shadow mirrored his steps, responded to movements rather than words, positioned himself between Red and anyone who approached. That kind of bond doesn't happen in a year. It happens in training fields, in combat zones, or somewhere equally unforgiving. A mechanic named Jonah once caught a glimpse of a military tattoo on Red's forearm when he rolled up his sleeves in summer. It was partially obscured faded, and not for show but unmistakably special operations. No one pressed him. The men who had done that kind of work didn't appreciate being asked. And he wasn't the kind of person you questioned just to satisfy curiosity. The trailer he lived in didn't have neighbors. Closest occupied property was a 1/4 mile away, and that was a seasonal hunter who came only in the fall. Red kept to himself. When the county came around once a year to check on property taxes, his name was listed as Richard T. Morrow, but nobody ever used it. Even the sheriff referred to him as Red in reports. Some said he collected old radios, that he had a wall of them inside the trailer wired to listen to distant frequencies. Others said he kept a footlocker buried under his floorboards with gear from a life long gone. Maybe both were true, maybe none of it was. But what everyone agreed on was this: he never caused trouble. He never looked for it. But if it came looking, for him or for anyone nearby, he was the kind of man who would not look away. Not anymore. Red didn't raise his voice, didn't throw punches, but you knew, just by being near him, that if something went sideways, he'd already calculated the exit, the fallback, and the consequences. He wasn't dangerous in the way loud men were. He was dangerous in the way quiet men get when they have nothing. Left to lose but one thing, and they've already decided what that thing is. The dog moved like water. That was the first thing people noticed, even if they couldn't quite put it into words. Not fast, not slow, just precise. He didn't lumber like most large dogs, didn't fidget or pant or bark at passing trucks. When he walked, every muscle in his body responded to invisible cues. And when he stopped, he didn't just sit, he placed himself, as if the act of staying still required just as much calculation as moving. Shadow was his name, though no one ever heard it from Red's mouth. It came from Cassie, the diner waitress, who had watched the dog's silhouette stretch across the tile floor one morning as the sun rose behind them. "He moves like a shadow," she said quietly, watching the way the dog positioned himself. Between Red and the entrance, the name stuck. He was a dark-furred German shepherd, larger than average, but not unnaturally so. His coat was mostly black, with shades of gray that shimmered only when the sun hit it just right. A long, thin scar curved above his right eye, not fresh, but not old enough to be forgotten. It gave his expression an extra edge, like someone who'd seen more than he was supposed to and remembered every detail. Most dogs would have lost their bite after a wound like that. Shadow hadn't. He wore a harness, thick-strapped and weathered, black like the rest of him. It had no patches or lettering, no hint of ownership or training, just reinforced loops, subtle buckles, and a clipped-on carabiner that looked military in design, but bore no markings. Some people assumed he was a service animal, but there were no tags, no certifications, and the few who had tried to approach and ask questions quickly learned not to get too close without permission. Shadow didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth or pull on his leash. He simply shifted his weight, raised his head, and stared. The kind of stare that made a person reconsider their choices, even if they didn't understand why. There was no barking, no that slow, deliberate focus that felt almost human. Children, usually fearless around dogs, gave him a wide berth. Their instincts caught something in him. Adults often missed. Something taut, coiled beneath the surface. Not violent, but vigilant. Like a soldier, waiting for the call to move, even when it hadn't come in years. Most mornings, when Red entered the diner, Shadow sat exactly to his right. Always the same position, the same alignment. If Red scooted into the booth, Shadow would shift slightly, keeping his eyes on the door or the nearest window. When the waitress brought food, the dog never moved. Not for bacon, not for dropped toast. Never sniffed, never pawed the air. Just watched Dot in the afternoons. Red would sometimes sit outside on a folding chair by his truck, letting the breeze stir the dust. Shadow lay beside him, not napping, but resting with intent. His ears would twitch at every passing engine, but his body stayed still. Occasionally, his nose would lift, catching a scent that no one else could detect. Red wouldn't react, but there was always the sense that both of them had logged the moment. People who lived near the truck stop swore they'd seen the dog react to things no one else noticed. A stranger pulling off the highway with mismatched plates. A drunk stumbling too close to the gas pump. A storm approaching miles away. Shadow would stiffen, then settle again, like he was making a quiet note for later. He had the alertness of something trained but not for tricks or obedient school. This was different. This was the alertness of a working animal with memory. Nobody knew where he'd come from. There were stories that he'd been a bomb sniffer, that he'd pulled wounded soldiers from wreckage, that he was retired like Red, and they'd come from the same battlefield, but no one knew for sure, and Red wasn't offering stories. What people did know was simple. That Shadow was always there. That he didn't make noise. That when he looked at you, you looked back. And that whatever bond existed between the man and the dog, it was deeper than habit. It was survival. Something had shaped Shadow into more than a pet. He had become an extension of Red himself, silent, deliberate, and not to be underestimated. The first thing anyone heard was the low rumble that didn't match the usual rhythm of the place. It came from the south, a growing sound that throbbed through the warm morning air. Then rose sharply as the engines downshifted, the kind of noise that didn't belong to pickup trucks or old sedans, or even long-haul rigs. This was louder, flashier, 3 sets of pipes whining and roaring in staggered timing. Cassie was pouring coffee when the windows began to hum. Not shake exactly, but vibrate faintly, like the sound itself was warning the room of what was about to walk in. They came in together, lined up like they'd rehearsed it. 3 motorcycles, chrome-heavy and freshly wax-strewed, into the parking lot, circling the fuel island once before idling near the front of the diner. One of the bikes backfired slightly, the sound sharp against the quiet of the morning. All 3 riders cut their engines at nearly the same time, leaving behind a silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt expectant. Inside, conversations dipped just slightly. The regulars looked up without looking obvious. A trucker at the window set down his fork and glanced over his shoulder. An older couple in the back booth exchanged a quiet glance. Even Cassie, who had worked morning shifts long enough to stop flinching at most noises, paused just a second longer before continuing down the aisle with the coffee pot. The bikers didn't come inside right away. They stayed near their bikes, pulling off helmets and stretching like they owned the air around them. One was tall and thick-shouldered, wearing a red leather jacket that looked more decorative than functional. Another had a denim vest over a black hoodie, his jeans tucked into tall boots, and a chain dangling from one hip like a weapon. The third was leaner, with mirrored sunglasses and a bandana tied under his chin. He leaned against his handlebars, like a man waiting for a reaction. They were loud without speaking, the kind of men who knew the effect they had and leaned into it. They laughed too hard at nothing, punched each other in the arms like schoolyard bullies, and made a show of shaking. Out their limbs like the ride had left them sore and wild, one of them turned up a portable speaker clipped to his belt, and music spilled out distorted rock chords and a screaming vocal line that clashed hard with the hum of the diner's local radio station. Red didn't move. He didn't look up. His fork still made its way through the last of his eggs. His coffee still sat half full. Shadow didn't move either. Just sat, eyes fixed straight ahead, posture unchanged. But those who knew the dog well would have noticed something, maybe the slight twitch of one ear, or the subtle lift in his chest as he took in the sound, the scent, the tone of what had just entered the space outside. After a minute or two, the bikers finally approached. One of them pushed open the diner's glass door with more force than necessary, letting it swing wide before catching it halfway. The bell above clanged in protest. All three entered in a row, tracking road dust and the smell of gasoline behind. Them conversations fell silent. Not completely, but enough. Enough to notice the shift. Enough to know that something in the temperature of the room had changed. They laughed as they walked past tables, commenting too loudly on the size of the portions, the smell of the bacon, the decor on the walls. Cassie gave them a tired smile, the kind that asked them not to cause trouble without using words. They slid into a booth near the front, but their eyes kept moving, taking stock of the space of the people, and finally, of the quiet man in the corner with the dog who hadn't moved since they walked in. The man in the red jacket elbowed one of the others and nodded in that direction. The glance turned into a stare. The stare turned into something else, and without saying a word, the quiet safety of the morning began to unravel, thread by thread. Cassie had worked the morning shift at the truck stop diner for almost 16 years. She'd seen plenty of travelers come through, gravel haulers, drifters, road trippers with bug-splattered windshields and directions written on napkins. Were tired, some were rude, most were forgettable. But every once in a while, someone walked in and the air just shifted. Not loud, not violent. Just different in that way her bones knew before her mind did. And this morning, when those three bikers crossed the threshold, that shift came in like a ripple beneath her skin. She was halfway through refilling a coffee cup at the counter, when the door clanged and the red-jacketed one stepped in like he was entering a stage. She paused just briefly, and then continued pouring, but her eyes trailed toward the front without turning her head. She caught their shadows before she saw their faces, loud boots, wide stances, the kind of swagger that didn't grow from confidence, but from habit. The second one laughed too loudly at something none of them had said, the kind of laugh meant to fill silence before anyone else could. Cassie's grip on the coffee pot tightened slightly as she turned. Her expression didn't change, still that smooth, unbothered mask she'd worn since the place had new booths and jukebox tokens, but behind her eyes, the math had started. She counted 3 men, all under 40. None of them familiar, all of them moving like they expected things to bend around them. She watched how they sat, not next to each other, but spread out, arms over the backs of seats, legs stretched far into the aisle. One of them tilted his chair back on 2 legs without caring who had to step around it. She moved slowly to their table, pad in hand. "Morning," she said, voice even, not friendly, not cold. "Coffee to start?" The one in the denim vest gave her a long look before answering. "Yeah, 3, and make it strong." The others smirked, as if that was somehow clever. Cassie nodded, once, then turned back to the counter. As she walked, her eyes slid toward the corner booth. Red hadn't moved. Shadow hadn't either. She didn't expect them to. But she noticed the dog's ears had tilted slightly, just enough to register what had changed in the room. That was enough to make her stomach pull tight. She poured 3 mugs and arranged them carefully on a tray. As she walked them back toward the front, the red-jacketed one leaned across the table and whispered something to the man across from him. All three laughed again. She heard only fragments, something about the dog, something about old man. The laughter didn't carry humor. It was sharp and dry, meant to echo when she set the mugs down. The one with the sunglasses leaned in just a little too close. "You always serve folks with military pets in here?" he asked. Voice too smooth, smiled too tight. Cassie didn't blink. "We serve coffee," she said. "Don't much care what someone's carrying, long as they're polite." The red jacket grinned wider. "That dog trained, or just looks tough?" Cassie didn't answer. She turned and walked away, letting the question die in the air behind her. She moved to the coffee machine, not because she needed to, but because it gave her a moment to breathe. Her back to the room, her hand rested against the metal warmer. Something wasn't right. She'd seen rough types before him and who came in with desert grit on their shoulders and bad moods in their boots. But this was different. These men weren't passing through. They were circling something, prodding, testing. And they'd noticed, shadowed. That was the part that settled wrong in her chest. Not that they looked, but that they stared. Like they didn't see a dog. Like they saw a challenge. Cassie glanced back over her shoulder. Red hadn't touched his coffee in a few minutes. Shadow hadn't blinked. She set the pot down quietly and moved to the register. From there, she could see the whole floor. She didn't panic, but she stayed alert. Something told her this wasn't going to end with a tip and a thank you. Not this time. The sound of a peanut hitting tile wasn't loud, but in the quiet lull of a late-morning diner, it echoed more than it should have. It rolled once, bounced against the leg of a chair, and stopped just shy of Shadow's left paw. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch. He stared straight ahead, focused on nothing and everything all at once. The tall biker in the red leather jacket leaned back in his booth, grinning. His laughter broke through the space like a dropped bottle. Loud, false, designed to be noticed. "What's with the freaking dog?" he asked, pointing with a crooked finger, still holding the remains of a peanut shell. "You see that? Didn't even blink. Like he's stuffed or something." His buddy in the denim vest snorted, grabbing another peanut from the bowl between them. "Maybe he's deaf. Or slow." He tossed the next one deliberately, a soft underhand arc that landed near the dog's nose. Shadow didn't react. The peanut hit the floor and stayed there. No sniffing, no shift in posture. His eyes didn't follow the movement. His head didn't tilt. He remained perfectly still, like a statue made of breath and muscle. The red-jacketed one raised his voice, not because he wanted an answer, but because he wanted to be heard. "Yo, old man," he called across the room. "Your dog broken or what?" Red didn't respond. He didn't even look up from his coffee. His hand rested loosely on the side of the mug, index finger tapping the ceramic in a slow, patient rhythm. His eyes stayed fixed on the window, watching something beyond the trucks, beyond the dust, beyond any of them. Cassie froze mid-step near the counter. She didn't need to turn around to see the smirk spreading across the biker's face. She could hear it in his voice, feel it in the air. The whole room had gone tight, not loud, just held in a strange kind of stillness. Like a breath that hadn't decided whether to leave the lungs yet. "Maybe he's trained," the denim one said. Softer at this time, but just as sharp. "You think he knows tricks? Roll over, sit pretty, fetch a bone." Shadow blinked once. The red-jacketed biker laughed again, leaning forward, elbows on the table. "Maybe he's one of them attack dogs, like military kind, secret commands, and all that, sick M, bite the man, all that serious stuff." He made a snapping motion with his hand. "Maybe you gotta say it in German or some spy language." The third biker, quiet until now, shook his head slowly, but didn't speak. He was watching the dog more closely, eyes narrowed, as if sensing something beneath the surface that his friends had missed. His foot tapped once under the table, but he didn't smile. Across the diner, Red still hadn't moved. He took another sip of coffee, slow and measured. His jaw didn't tighten. His shoulders didn't rise. But there was something in the angle of his body, something that changed without actually shifting. Cassie noticed it first. The others felt it a second later. A stillness that wasn't passive. A silence that pressed back. The peanut sat untouched. On the floor, Shadow's leash remained slack, draped between his harness and the booth's metal leg. His ears flicked once just, a twitch hand, then stilled again. The biker in red made a clicking sound with his tongue. "Come on, pup," he said in a voice meant to mock affection. "You don't want to play with us." Shadow's head turned slowly. Just a fraction, just enough. He didn't show his teeth, didn't make a sound, but the weight of his stare locked the man in place. For a moment, the laughter stopped. The red-jacketed biker froze, still half grinning, but no longer sure why. His hand, still extended midpoint, lowered an inch before he caught himself. Cassie moved quietly toward the table, coffee pot in hand, and placed it between them without saying a word. Then she turned and walked away. Red finally looked up. Just once, just a glance, and then returned. To his coffee, as if none of it had ever happened, the room stayed quiet after that, and the peanut stayed right where it landed. The diner's hum had returned, but it was thinner now, conversation down to murmurs. Forks moved without clatter, and even the trucker at the counter had paused his chewing. The three bikers had stopped laughing, but their energy hadn't softened. If anything, it had condensed the kind of heat that coils rather than explodes. One leaned back in the booth, arms draped across the top like he owned the place. The other two watched Red from across the room with the slow curiosity of men who enjoy poking at still water just to see what might rise. The one in red leather stood first. He stretched as though he were merely shaking off a long ride, rolled his neck, then started toward the corner booth with casual steps that weren't quite casual. The denim vest followed, one hand tucked in his back pocket, the other rolling a toothpick between his fingers. The third man hung back near the counter but kept his eyes trained on the dog. Cassie moved instinctively to the far end of the diner, putting herself in line with the hallway to the supply closet. Not because she was afraid she'd worked truck stops long enough to see posturing, but because she knew better than to get between two forces that were starting to recognize each other as threats. Red didn't look up. He hadn't moved since they started walking, just one hand resting on the coffee mug, the other flat on the table. Shadow remained seated, body loose, ears slightly lifted, eyes on the forward arc where the men approached. The red-jacketed biker stopped at the end of the booth and tilted his head. "So," he said, loud enough for the room, "what kind of tricks your mutt know?" No answer. Denham leaned in from the other side, grinning. "Come on, man, we're just being friendly. Ain't every day you see a dog sit that still," he broke in. "Or just boring." Still no answer. Red didn't shift, didn't even blink. But there was something in the way. Shadow slowly adjusted the position of his front paws. Not a full move. Just enough that both of them, if they were watching closely, would see that the dog was no longer in rest position. He was braced. "Bet he bites, right?" Red Jacket asked. "That its secret bite command?" He made a snapping sound with his fingers, loud and sharp, right near the dog's ear. "What's it take? Latin? Russian? That what gets him going?" Shadow. It didn't move, but his pupils had narrowed. A line of tension now ran through his back, barely visible to the untrained eye. But it was there, coiled like cable, drawn tight. Or maybe, Denham said, stepping in closer, he's just an old mutt some guy dresses up to feel dangerous. The third man hadn't moved from his place near the counter. His eyes were still, fixed on Shadow, his expression less amused than the others. He seemed to be taking stock now, reconsidering the tone they'd set. Red finally moved. Just a small thing. He set down the coffee mug. The ceramic met the table with a deliberate click sound, measured but final. Then he raised his eyes. Not fast, not dramatic. He looked first at the man in red, then at the one in denim, and finally at the dog. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Whatever was exchanged in that glance passed beneath the surface. Too quiet. For sound, Shadow's head tilted just slightly, acknowledging something only the two of them understood. The air tightened. The men standing at the booth didn't laugh anymore. Red Jacket's smirk had thinned, and Denham had stopped rocking on his heels. "You're not much of a talker, huh?" one of them muttered. Shadow's eyes never left them. Cassie stood at the far end of the room, one hand resting on the edge of the doorframe. She watched the bikers, then the dog, then Redand realized what she was seeing wasn't confrontation, it was warning. Not loud, not overt, but unmistakable, and still, Red said nothing. The diner had slipped into a silence that wasn't natural, not the usual hush of mid-morning when truckers finished their meals and conversations trailed off. This was different, to quiet, to still, as if everyone inside had agreed, without speaking, to stop breathing at the same time. At the center of it all was the dog. Shadow didn't move. He sat at Red's side like a fixed part of the booth itself, like something that had always been there and always would be. His body was relaxed, but not slack. Ears perked, not pinned. Eyes open, but not wide. The leash hung from his harness like a forgotten detail, not something necessary for control. If a stranger walked in just then, they might think the dog was resting. But anyone who watched closely, anyone really watching, would see that every muscle under that dark coat was listening. The red-jacketed biker shifted his weight, but the moment had begun to turn on him. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way the waitress had stopped moving. Or maybe it was the dog howl. It didn't bark or growl or snap like other dogs might. How it didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't react in any of the usual ways. He'd seen animals that postured before. This wasn't that. This was something else. Something colder. Something that calculated. "You sure he's alive?" the biker said, but his voice had lost the sharp edge it had carried just minutes ago. Still, no answer from Red, no shift in his shoulders, no flicker of acknowledgement. Just that steady, unreadable gazing beside him. A dog that seemed carved from silence. The man in denim leaned a little closer, now more curious than mocking. He crouched, just slightly, dropping his head to the dog's eye level as if expecting a growl, a snarl, something to react to. Shadow didn't so much as twitch. His eyes followed the movement, slow and unblinking, not because he was alarmed, but because he was measuring. The third biker, still standing back, had stopped pretending to be part of the joke. He watched from a safe distance, arms crossed, the faint crease of concern beginning to settle between his brows. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself, but something about that dog had cut through whatever mood they thought they had brought with them. Shadow's head tilted just a fraction left, then back to center. It was subtle, almost nothing, but it was enough. Cassie, watching from behind the counter, caught it. She had seen it before, months ago, when a drunk trucker had thrown a beer bottle in the parking lot during closing. That same stillness, that same tiny tilt of the head, and then only then had Red stood up and said one word. And the situation had ended before it began. But this time, Red hadn't said anything. Not yet. The biker and Red seemed suddenly aware of how long he'd been standing there, of how close he'd leaned. He straightened up with a forced shrug, trying to make the moment small again, as if he could laugh it off and slip away. "Don't scare me," he muttered, though no one had suggested it did. Shadow didn't respond. His gaze remained steady, detached, watching, not warning, judging maybe, or waiting. Red finally moved, not much, just enough to reach for the check. Cassie had left at the edge of the table earlier. His fingers closed around it, and the simple act seemed to draw the line none of them had known existed until now. The biker stepped back, and for the first time since they entered, he looked unsure of himself. He didn't turn his back. He didn't apologize, but his hands slipped into his pockets, and his eyes dropped away from the dogs and Shadow. Shadow didn't flinch, because he didn't need to. The bell above the diner door gave a dull clang as it closed behind Red. The morning sun had climbed just enough to cast long shadows across the parking lot, stretching over the cracked asphalt and across the faded white lines that separated the few vehicles scattered around. Red moved with the same measured pace he always did, heading toward the register just inside the gas station's side office to pay for his meal. He didn't glance back. He didn't need to. Shadow was where he always was, tethered loosely to the side mirror of the old Ford parked along the edge of the lot. Sitting upright, eyes forward, posture still. The leash was mostly for formality. Red knew that. Everyone who'd ever spent more than 5 minutes watching that dog knew he didn't need it. But Red used it anyway. Rules were rules, and the last thing he needed was trouble over an unleashed animal, no matter how well behaved. Bikers had stepped out a few minutes before Red, lingering near their motorcycles, fiddling with helmets, cracking jokes, just loud enough to remind the diner they were still the loudest ones in the room. When Red passed them without a word, they exchanged a glance, something just beneath the surface, something too casual to be natural. The tall one in the red leather waited until Red disappeared around the corner of the building. The other two stayed by the bikes. One lit a cigarette, the other leaned back on his seat, tapping ash on the pavement without looking up. The red jacket moved slowly, casually, like a man killing time. He walked past the truck, eyes on the dog, letting his boots fall just a little heavier against the concrete. Shadow didn't turn his head, but his ears shifted. The man stopped a few feet away, pretending to stretch. Cracking his neck with an exaggerated twist, he looked around, once one quick glance, toward the gas station office where Red stood in line. Then he turned toward the dog, no warning, no build-up, just a sudden step forward and a sharp kick, low and fast, aimed straight at the ribs. The sound was a dull thud against Shadow's side, muscle absorbing the blow with a sickening weight. The leash jerked slightly against the mirror post. Shadow staggered half a step, not from pain but from surprise. His body absorbed the impact without a whimper. A sharp laugh burst from the man in red, too loud, too pleased with himself. Huh? Not so tough now, are ya? From the bikes, the denim vest chuckled and called out, "Careful, man, you might wake the robot." Another kick followed, not as hard, but deliberate. A nudge, almost a test. Shadow's eyes moved first, not toward the boot. Not toward the man, but toward the truck. Then toward the diner door. His body remained still, but something in his expression had shifted. Not fear, not confusion, a calculation, a weight. The third man, the quiet one, watched from a few feet away, his posture less amused now. He didn't laugh. He just watched, the cigarette in his fingers burning down between two long pulls. Red hadn't seen it. Not yet, inside the building. Behind thick glass, he was handing over a few bills to the cashier. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't growl. His breathing was even controlled. The red-jacketed biker leaned in close now, crouching so his face was level with the dog's. "You're just a statue, huh?" he sneered. "Some dead man's idea of a tough pet?" Shadow blinked once. Then he exhaled, a low, controlled breath through his nose. Nothing else, the man stood up and gave one last glance toward the diner door. Still nothing from Red, but Shadow's eyes had stopped watching the man. They were now watching the door. He knew what was coming, and when it did, he would be ready. The sun was higher now, casting a bleached glare across the pavement. Heat shimmered faintly off the hood of the Ford, and the parking lot felt suspended in the kind of late-morning quiet that sits just before the day tips into noise. Except for the laughter, it was short, sharp, and mean-carried from the corner near the motorcycles to the empty air where Shadow sat. UNMOVING. The first biker, the one in red leather, was still standing close, pacing slightly in front of the truck. Like a bored predator, his confidence had swollen after the first kick. When nothing happened, when the dog hadn't barked or lunged or shown even a flash of teeth, he'd interpreted it the only way men like him ever did, as permission. Shadow's leash was still clipped to the truck's mirror, a thick, reinforced strap with no slack left in it. It held firm, a length chosen carefully by Red Knot, so tight it would strain, not so loose it would invite problems. It had never needed to hold the dog back before. The second biker came over then, denim vest, tall and narrow, cigarette still dangling from his lips. He approached with exaggerated slowness, like someone about to poke something they didn't believe could bite. "What's the matter, boy?" he said, lowering his voice like he was talking to a pet behind a fence. "Your owner, not here to give you orders. You only move when told, huh?" Shadow didn't blink. His eyes had adjusted again, one on the new man, the other still occasionally flicking toward the gas station door. Still no Red, still waiting. The denim biker crouched down next to him and clucked his tongue mockingly. "This thing even real? Looks like a damn training dummy." He reached out, just 2 fingers extended, and flicked the metal tag on Shadow's collar. It made a light, ringing noise, barely audible, but the vibration ran along the harness strap like a pulled wire. Still, Shadow didn't move. The man in red barked out another laugh. "He's broken, man, like a toy with the batteries out." And then came the second kick. It wasn't hard, more of a jab this time, aimed at the dog's shoulder, but it was deliberate, casual, like shoving a chair with your foot. Disrespect dressed up as curiosity. The leash jerked again, taut between Shadow and the truck, but this time something shifted. Shadow stood, not fast. Not suddenly. He rose in a smooth, fluid arcs, low enough not to startle, but with a force that pulled the leash tight to its last inch. The strap creaked. The metal clip held. His paws were wide now, planted. His shoulders had squared. And his head, once still, now tilted slowly toward the denim biker, locking onto him with an expression so controlled, so cold, that it no longer resembled the look of a dog at all. It was something else, a readiness, a verdict. The biker stumbled back a half step, suddenly unsure. He dropped the cigarette, the ember flaring against the pavement. "Hey-ah," he started, but his voice caught. Shadow didn't growl. That's what made it worse. There was no warning, no flash of teeth, no raised hackles, just silence, poised and burning. The third biker, still at the edge of the parking lot, straightened up slightly now, watching more closely. His arms were no longer folded. His expression had changed from passive amusement to something closer to calculation. The building, Red, had turned away from the register. He stepped through the door, holding his receipt between two fingers, eyes already scanning. He saw Shadow. First Dot, then the tight leash Dot, then the space between the dog and the two men. Red's jaw didn't clench. His pace didn't change. Toward the truck with the same measured steps as always. But Shadow saw him now. Shadow's ears lifted, his body still rigid, but waiting. He didn't need the leash anymore, not now. All he needed was the word. The door swung open behind him with the faint chime of the rusted bell. But Red didn't rush. His eyes adjusted quickly to the brightness outside, narrowing just slightly as the midday sun poured over the lot. The receipt crinkled faintly and his hand caught in the wind that always seemed to tug at the flat desert space around the truck stop. He moved slowly at first, like he always did, out of habit more than age, but then he heard it. One bark, Dot, sharp, short, not frantic. Not wild, just one. And it wasn't the sound that made Preez it, was the fact that Shadow had barked at all, in all the years they'd been together. Red could count on one hand the number of times that dog had made noise in public. Even when challenged, even when poked, prodded, teased, Shadow was trained to remain silent. That was part of his code. But now the silence had broken. Red stepped off the curb with more urgency. Shadow was no longer sitting. He stood rigid, legs squared, body leaning slightly forward. His ears were locked on target, head low, and eyes fixed on the two bikers who now stood just out of reach. The leash was pulled to its furthest length, taut and straining, anchored. To the truck's side mirror, his mouth was open now, teeth showing, not in a frenzied snarl, but in a controlled display. A mechanical precision built from muscle memory. The man in red leather still stood closest. He held one hand up, not in surrender, but in that tentative posture people use when they realize they may have gone too far. The one in the denim vest hovered behind him, half shielding himself with the bulk of the other. Neither of them laughed. Now, Shadow barked again a second time. It was louder than the first, cracking across the empty lot with a sound that startled the birds from the light poles. The leash rattled. The dog didn't lunge, but he was braced, waiting. Red's steps slowed just slightly as he took in the scene. His face didn't change much, just a tightening at the jaw, the faint flicker of something sharp in his eyes. He folded the receipt in half and tucked it into his back pocket. The third, biker still standing at a distance, now looked directly at Red, trying to read him. Maybe looking for a cue that this was all still some harmless game, but Red gave him nothing. He walked to the truck, not rushing, not running, and stopped just shy of the dog's reach. His hands remained loose at his sides. He didn't touch the leash. He didn't even look at the men first. He looked at Shadow. The dog turned his head slightly, just enough to see Red out of the corner of his eye, but didn't move otherwise. Red finally spoke, and his voice was low, almost casual. "What happened?" Neither of the bikers answered. Looked at the man in red leather, then at the other. His gaze didn't linger. Just enough to take the measure of each. Then he looked at the tension in the leash. The way Shadow's weight had shifted forward, how every muscle was poised in a way that only meant one thing. Permission awaited. He exhaled through his nose and took one step closer to the dog. His voice barely rose. Down. Shadow didn't hesitate. He eased his stance, body dropping to a sit with slow precision. The bark gone, the teeth gone, but the tension not yet fully released. He kept his eyes forward, Red crouched beside him, checking. The leash then gently ran a hand along the dog's ribs. When he felt the slight stiffness where the kick had landed, his eyes flicked up not to the dog but to the man in red, and still he said nothing, because by now they both understood whatever had happened, words were no longer the currency of warning. For a few long seconds, the scene was suspended in a tight, breathless stillness. The only sound was the soft ticking of a nearby fuel pump, distant and irrelevant. Red remained crouched beside Shadow, his hand resting gently on the dog's harness, just behind the shoulder. Shadow sat still, but every part of him remained coiled. The leash was still taut, angled from the mirror post like a held breath. His ears never left the two men still standing, close now farther apart than they'd been, each subtly shifting their weight in a poor attempt to look casual. Red slowly stowed, his knees cracked faintly as he straightened, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes, calm and unreadable, passed over the bikers again. He didn't scan them like a man looking for answers, he sized them like someone choosing outcomes. He rolled his shoulders once beneath the worn canvas of his jacket, then reached down and unhooked the leash from the side mirror. The sound was soft but final, metal clicking against metal. He remained in place, frozen and alert, but the tension in his posture deepened not as fear, but as readiness. His chest rose slower now, his body was drawn in tight, balanced over his paws. A stillness that suggested not peace, but precision. The bikers didn't move either, not yet, but something passed between the men, unspoken ripple of recognition. They were starting to realize what kind of dog they'd been baiting. Not a pet, not a backyard mutt, something different. The man in red let his grin falter. The denim vest beside him ran a hand through his hair, flicking sweat that hadn't been there before. Red looked down once at Shadow. The dog didn't need a look back. Then Red raised two fingers. The gesture was slight, sharp, and then came the word, engage. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was flat, precise, not a threat hand instruction. The effect was immediate. Shadow surged forward, not wild, not reckless, controlled, direct. His front paws struck the pavement with force. His body low, shoulders angled, speed held in check by purpose. He moved with the accuracy of something trained not just to attack, but to calculate. The man in red didn't even finish his step back before Shadow reached him. A sharp bark ripped the silence as Shadow lunged upward, not for the face, not for the throat. His teeth clamped around the biker's dominant arm, locking just above the elbow with stunning force. The man screamed, stumbling as Shadow's weight pulled him sideways. There was no thrashing, no shaking. The hold was firm, absolute, a command in the shape of pressure. The man went down on one knee, trying to swing with his free hand. But Shadow shifted, instantly twisting his body and adjusting the grip without ever losing contact. His back legs dug in like anchors. The denim biker backed up a full step, eyes wide now. Hey, call him off. But Red didn't move. He stood like a man watching something unfold exactly as expected. His arms were at his sides, not clenched, not concerned. Shadow didn't bark again. He didn't growl. He didn't need to. The biker on the ground froze as the pain set in, not unbearable. Not bleeding, but unmistakably clear. The dog was in control, and he wasn't letting go. The quiet biker the third was already walking away. Backpedaling toward his bike without a word, Red waited 10 more seconds, then gave another signal, one finger lowered. Shadow released instantly, stepping back and resuming his ready posture without breaking eye contact with the man on the ground. The biker clutched his arm, gasping but said nothing, and still, Red didn't speak because everything that needed to be said had just been delivered with 2 fingers and a single word. Shadow's release had been clean, without hesitation or wasted motion. The moment Red's finger dropped, the dog disengaged like a machine resetting its gears. Crouch. The man on the pavement clutched his arm and rolled slightly away, eyes wide with the kind of fear that came not from injury, but from recognition that what stood before him was not just a dog, it was something trained, something precise. Red gave no further instructions. He didn't need to. The engagement protocol had already been initiated, and Shadow knew what to do. His movements now were not instinct, they were procedure. The dog dropped lower. belly just above the concrete, his weight shifting onto the balls of his feet, his tail stiffened behind him, not wagging, not raised, just balanced. His ears flattened against his skull, streamlining his profile. Vest, who had taken 3 steps back but was still within range, Shadow pivoted in one seamless movement. His muscles coiled, then released, propelling him forward in a blur of force. It wasn't the run of a dog chasing prey, it was a tactical sweep. The bike's panic, finally cracking through whatever bravado he had left. His boot skidded on the pavement as he turned, but Shadow was already there, intercepting. He didn't go for the leg, he didn't strike. Froze the man in place. It was the bark of a dog that knew how to control space. Red remained behind them, arms still down, body still. Shadow didn't lunge this time, he didn't bite. He stood low, chest out, front paws wide, head raised just slightly, eyes never leaving the man's movements. If the man reached for his bike, stepped left, stepped back a knee of it, Shadow was already calculating response. The biker froze mid-reach, his hand hovering inches from the handlebar. He looked past the dog toward Red, as if waiting for someone to call off the storm. Red remained silent. Shadow's eyes twitched once, catching the movement of the first man behind him, now rising slowly from the ground. The second threat, the proximity, was noted, processed, filed, but no move was made. Shadow didn't panic. He adjusted his footing by an inch. Years of conditioning surged beneath the surface of every breath the dog took. This was more than obedience. This was protocol, the kind drilled into elite units where human lives depended on the ability to read, decide, and neutralize without chaos. Shadow's paws flexed slightly, ready to close the gap if the biker moved again. But the man knew better. Now, he raised both hands slowly, palms open. Not quite surrender more, a wordless appeal. The look in his eyes had shifted from mocking to pleading. Shadow waited behind him. The first biker leaned back against the pavement, wincing and holding his arm. He didn't move. He knew better now. The third biker, the quiet one, had already mounted his motorcycle. The engine wasn't running, but he was perched and ready, helmet in hand, watching the scene unfold with careful silence. His eyes flicked between Red and Shadow, then settled on Shadow alone. Red finally moved. Just one step closer, his boots scraped faintly against the concrete. Shadow heard it, and without needing a word, without needing a signal, he adjusted. Agonizing off, backing away from the biker's escape path by 2 feet. He never turned his back. The canine formation wasn't just about attack, it was control, territory, calculation, and right now, every square inch of that parking lot belonged to Shadow. The tension in the air hadn't lifted, it had only shifted. The man in the denim vest remained frozen, unsure of whether to retreat or risk a motion that might trigger another response. But behind them, something changed. The first biker, the one who had taken the bite, had slowly risen to one knee. He still held his injured arm close to his chest, jaw tight, pain in his eyes. But something else flickered there now too. Anger, embarrassment, the humiliated instinct to retaliate. He thought he could take the dog. By surprise, Red caught the shift out of the corner of his eye. He didn't call out, he didn't intervene. His silence held a purpose, and Shadow knew it. The biker pushed himself to both feet with a grunt. Taking advantage of the few seconds Shadow's attention was divided between 2 targets. He reached to his boot and pulled something small, something sharp. A folding knife snapped open with a metallic click, catching the light just enough for Red to see Shadow moved before the man could even shift his stance. It wasn't a jump. It wasn't even a lunge. It was a strike. Shadow's body dropped low and swept forward with incredible speed, aiming not for the hand or the blade, but the leg. His target was precise, the space just behind the biker's knee. The biker's leg buckled instantly. He didn't fall gracefully. His body crumpled in a sharp sideways collapse, his hand flying out to break the fall. The knife clattered to the pavement and skidded beneath the front tire of his own bike. Shadow was already repositioned before the man hit the ground, fully circling with rapid steps. Chest lowered again, body between the man and the weapon. The biker let out a yell that was part pain, part disbelief. It echoed off the metal siding of the diner. Inside, the clatter of a dropped plate followed. Cassie, the waitress, was the first one out the door. She stepped onto the sidewalk with a towel still over her shoulder and froze at the sight. Her eyes darted to the biker on the ground, to Shadow, standing alert and ready, then to Red, standing silent and still. Behind her, a man in a sheriff's uniform, older, balding, half done with his sandwich, followed more slowly. He didn't draw his weapon, no more than necessary, no less than required. The second biker, now visibly sweating, finally took a full step back and put both hands in the air. "We didn't mean nothin'," he said, voice thinner now. "We were just messin'. Didn't think the mutt was gonna go full robot." Red didn't respond. He still hadn't spoken since that single word. Instead, he stepped closer to the downed man and gave him one look. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even angry. It was the kind of look that told the man this had been coming for a long time. Then he crouched beside Shadow again and placed a hand gently on his neck. Shadow's breathing slowed, his muscles loosened, but his eyes stayed. Locked forward, order hadn't been restored. It had been enforced. The clatter of the fallen plate inside had barely stopped ringing when the diner's door slammed open again. Cassie was already halfway into the parking lot, one hand still gripping her apron, eyes darting across the scene. Behind her, a trucker, in a faded ball cap and steel-toed boots, jogged out after hearing the scream. The sound had traveled through the walls like a warning bell, and now everyone inside the diner was crowding the windows. Unsure of what they were witnessing, Cassie stopped short, stunned by what she saw. One biker was already on the ground, curled around his knee, the knife now forgotten beneath a motorcycle. Shadow stood rigid just feet away, his eyes sweeping in constant motion. Reading the field like a soldier trained for chaos, the second biker denim vest, nervous hands, had taken one last step back. But that step was enough. Shadow moved again, silent as a gust of wind and just as fast. His trajectory was tight, controlled. There was no excess movement. His paws struck the pavement with speed, launching him diagonally across the lot toward the second man. The biker saw the blur too late. He turned to run, one foot lifted off the ground, but Shadow was already there. The impact wasn't a full-body takedown, it was surgical. Shadow lunged upward and clamped his jaws just above the elbow of the man's right arm, locking down in one precise, practiced motion. The biker screamed, stumbling backward as the weight of the dog twisted his upper body off balance. He tried to shake free, but it only made things worse. Shadow didn't thrash. He didn't growl. He held. The man's knees buckled. He hit the ground hard, both hands flailing now, one trapped in the dog's grip, the other pushing at the air like he could wave the pain away. Blood wasn't pouring, but the pressure was unmistakable. Controlled, designed to disable without destroy. Cassie covered her mouth with both hands. The trucker stepped forward instinctively, then stopped, recognizing the dynamic for what it was. This wasn't a dog out of control. This was something far more trained, far more specific. Shadow adjusted his hold slightly, shifting with the biker's weight to keep him from escaping. He repositioned, locking the man flat to the ground without adding force. It was the kind of restraint that didn't rely on violence. It relied on knowledge of where pain begins and where panic ends. The biker whimpered now, no longer shouting. His bravado was gone. He looked up and saw Red walking calmly across the lot. One hand rested on his hip, the other still holding Shadow's leash, though the slack dragged along the ground behind him. Red didn't look at the man pinned to the asphalt. He looked at Shadow. The eye contact lasted only a second. Then Red said, quietly, "Release." Shadow let go instantly. The biker gasped and rolled to his side, cradling his arm, but not daring to get up. His breath came in shallow gulps, eyes wide and glassy. Shadow backed away just 2 steps, circling slowly to stand between Red and the 2 downed men. His ears stayed perked. His breathing remained steady. He was ready again, even after the takedown. The murmurs inside the diner turned louder. Someone knocked on the window. A man muttered, "That ain't a pet." Another said, "That's military." Cassie looked at Red narrowly, looked at him. She had seen him come in for years, quiet, alone, never speaking unless spoken to. She knew he lived out near the old service road, knew he never missed a Sunday morning meal. But this was different. This wasn't just an old man with a loyal dog. This was a man who had brought a weapon trained to think, and something had triggered its release. The biker in the red jacket had been silent for too long. He'd watched his friends go down, one from a sudden strike to the leg, the other pinned and disarmed with surgical precision. The parking lot had changed. It no longer belonged to them. The laughter, the noise, the swagger had all drained out and left something heavy in the air, something primal, the kind of silence that only came when everyone was waiting for what would happen next. He knew then that he wanted no part of it. Without a word, he turned. It was a fast pivot, practiced even his boots ground against the gravel as he darted, for the row of bikes still lined up outside the diner. His was the middle one, chrome pipes, red flames on the tank, keys already in the ignition. The diner window reflected his movement, a blur of motion, muscles tight with urgency. He wasn't just trying to leave, he was trying to vanish. Red didn't move. Shadow did. He didn't need a command this time. He had already calculated the distance, the direction, the intention. The shift in the man's posture before the run had even started had triggered the response. His body launched forward in a near horizontal sprint. This time, he didn't aim to bite. This was about placement. As the red-jacketed biker reached for the handlebars, Shadow slid into his path, intercepting at the front wheel. There was no barking at first, just movement. The dog stopped directly in front of the motorcycle, standing. Still, legs apart, chest low but not crouched. A silent wall. The biker froze mid-reach. Then Shadow growled. It wasn't high-pitched or frantic. It was low-deep and resonant. It started from the diaphragm and echoed from the chest, reverberating in the space between them like a warning bell made of gravel and thunder. The biker's hand hovered near the ignition, but never touched it. Shadow's growl continued. It didn't rise, it didn't fluctuate. It was steady, sustained, the vocal equivalent of a line drawn in concrete. The man backed up one step. Shadow moved with him, mirroring the distance, maintaining control of the gap. Another step, another. Match. It was a dance the biker didn't want to finish. The door to the diner opened again, and someone muttered, "He's not letting him go." Others stepped outside now, hesitant but curious. A few had phones up. Cassie stayed near the edge of the lot, not interfering. The man in red stared down at Shadow and slowly lifted his hands in the faintest gesture, not a full command, just acknowledgement. Shadow's growl lessened but didn't stop. The biker looked up at Red, eyes wide and breathing hard. "I didn't touch it," he said, voice cracking. "I didn't kick the damn dog." Red said nothing. The biker shook his head. "I just wanted to leave, man." Shadow took a step closer, forcing the man into retreat again. But then Red gave a small nod. Shadow stopped moving. The growl faded, not fully relaxed, but paused like a soldier awaiting further instruction. The biker stood still, hands raised slowly. He backed away from the bike without turning. Every movement was calculated now, cautious. The bravado of earlier replaced by the uneasy realization that this wasn't a fight anyone could win. He passed his injured friend on the ground, then the other still cradling his arm, and kept backing toward the edge of the lot. Shadow didn't follow. He stood where he was, between the bikes and the man, breathing steady, eyes fixed like a statue with a pulse. The red-jacketed biker, finally, out of range, turned and fled down the dirt path toward the highway shoulder. He didn't look back. The dust had barely settled around the red-coated biker's retreat when the second Mantha 1 Shadow had brought to the ground twitched, testing the possibility of escape. He shifted slightly, thinking perhaps the dog's attention had moved on. It hadn't. Shadow's eyes flicked toward him, and that was all it took. The biker stopped moving again, breath tight, shoulders locked, but something in the air shifted an instinct in Shadow that sensed another threat. The first biker, the one with the injured leg, had risen just enough to kneel, his good hand curling toward the handlebar of one of the nearby motorcycles. The move was slow, almost subtle, but Shadow registered it. In the same second, he turned toward the new motion, muscles drawing tight again, haunches lowering, and then he surged forward. It wasn't a full attack yet, just the start of a lunge. The target was clearly the biker's arm reaching for the handlebar. The angle, the tension in Shadow's spine, the direction of his movement all pointed to another precision takedown. The crowd near the diner tensed. Cassie inhaled sharply. The man on the pavement froze. Then came Red's voice, one word, steady, measured, not shouted. The sound cut through the tension like a blade. Instantly, Shadow stopped. His front paw landed exactly halfway through the motion. His body lowered but didn't advance. One step more would have made contact, but he didn't take it. He stood mid-lunge, legs coiled, head lowered, breath sharp through his nose, eyes locked. He didn't growl. He didn't twitch. He simply held position frozen, still, with every muscle ready but unmoving. The biker on the ground stared back, unsure if he should breathe. A few feet away, the sheriff, who had stepped out during the commotion, muttered under his breath, "That's discipline. That's real training." Cassie nodded but didn't take her eyes off the dog. Shadow's tail didn't wag. His tongue didn't hang. He wasn't waiting to play. This was work, and the command to hold, once given, was absolute. Red stepped forward slowly, not rushing. His boots crunched across the gravel, each step deliberate. He passed by the diner's porch, nodded briefly to the trucker standing nearby, then walked a wide arc around the bikers still grounded. His path took him past Shadow's flank, close enough to reach down, but he didn't. He just stood beside him, gaze fixed ahead. Shadow didn't break form. The man on the ground, still frozen near the handlebar, finally pulled his hand back, inch by inch. He said nothing. Red watched him do it and gave no reaction. Only when the hand was fully withdrawn and laid flat on the pavement did Red speak again. "Down." Shadow eased back slowly, withdrawing from the coiled posture. He didn't break eye contact with the man on the ground, but his front legs bent, his body lowering until he was once again in a stable, neutral crouch. Not relaxed, never relaxed, but no longer engaged. The visual effect was immediate. Everyone watching could see it. This wasn't just a dog obeying a command. It was a soldier standing down. Cassie exhaled, the breath catching halfway, as if her body had forgotten how to breathe until now. The biker finally slumped onto the asphalt fully, his entire body deflating with relief. He didn't try to get up again. Neither did the others. The parking lot, once a stage for taunting noise and cheap intimidation, was now a quiet field of control, not chaos order, enforced not by brute force, but by a bond between handler and dog that was unshakable. Shadow remained, down still, waiting. The low rumble of tires on gravel was the only new sound breaking the quiet. A dusty white cruiser rolled into the lot, its tires crunching over small stones as it came to a slow stop near the diner's porch. The engine idled for a few seconds, then cut out. A moment later, the driver's side door opened. Sheriff Calloway stepped out, one boot at a time, shoulders stiff from age, but posture still upright. The sun caught the corner of his mirrored sunglasses, though the rest of his uniform was faded by years in the Mojave light. His radio crackled softly as he adjusted it on his shoulder. A garbled voice on the other end, asking if he was still on scene. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he surveyed the parking lot with the slow, practiced look of a man who'd seen plenty on, missed nothing. He took in the scattered positions. One biker seated against the rear tire of a motorcycle, clutching his arm. Another lying near the sidewalk, breathing shallow and not moving much. A third biker, long gone, barely. A dust trail left where he'd run. And in the center of it all, Red, standing quiet, hands by his sides. Beside him, Shadow remained crouched, motionless, still alert but calm now. Calloway didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't bark orders, he simply started walking. Cassie stepped forward to intercept him, but paused when he held up one hand gently, signaling that he didn't need the full story, not yet. He already had enough pieces to assemble the edges of it. "Didn't expect to see you up this early," Calloway said as he reached Red. His voice was dry and even, carrying no judgment. Red didn't respond right away. His eyes remained on Shadow, waiting for the dog to shift fully into rest. Only when Shadow's stance softened and his breathing returned to baseline did Red glance at the sheriff. "Didn't expect trouble either," Red said. Calloway looked down at the two bikers, then up at the lingering onlookers near the diner. "Windows? I got a call about a disturbance," he muttered. Didn't say it involved K9 South. Red gave a barely perceptible shrug. Cassie approached, then voiced low. They came in loud, started poking at the dog. One of them kicked it. Red didn't start anything. The trucker nodded from behind her. That dog held until he gave the word. Calloway grunted, rubbing the back of his neck. Of course, he did. That dog's smarter than half the deputies I've trained. He turned back toward Red. You keep Shadow's paperwork updated. Always. Still registered as retired service K9. Red nodded. Calloway crouched briefly near the biker with the injured leg, but didn't touch him. The man didn't look up, clearly trying to remain still and unnoticed. What did they want? The sheriff asked, without turning. Didn't ask, Red replied, didn't care. Calloway stood again with a small groan in his knees. I'll need statements, but not right now. Medical first. He gestured toward his cruiser and spoke into the radio. Send an ambulance to mile marker 73. We've got 2 with injuries, non-life-threatening, possibly fractured elbow and knee. No shots fired. He paused, then added dryly, No, I'm not joking. The radio crackled again. Calloway looked back at Red. You want to file charges? Red glanced at the downed men, then shook his head. But the reports say they got, in their own way. The sheriff nodded. Same as last time. Then Shadow rose slowly beside Red, responding to a shift in his breathing rather than a word. The tension that had saturated the parking lot now began to thin. Calloway turned and walked back to his cruiser, his presence no longer needed to manage the scene. Order had already been established, just not by him. Inside the diner, the sound had returned in soft, nervous layers. Forks tapped against plates again, coffee refilled into half-empty cups. Conversations buzzed in quiet pockets, but no one had really gone back to normal. The aftermath was still, thick in the air, lingering like smoke after a dry lightning storm. And in the corner booth where Red had been eating earlier, Sheriff Calloway now sat with a notepad worn at the edges, flipping to a blank page. Cassie stood across from him, arms crossed tightly over her apron. She'd taken off her name tag. At some point, now clipped to the top of her order pad like a shield, they kicked the dog, she said again. Twice, Calloway nodded, not looking up. You saw it? Of course I saw it. I was pouring coffee when the first one laughed about it. Then the tall one in red went out and she stopped, shaking her head. They weren't afraid. Of the leash, thought it was a joke. He scribbled something and read, he say anything before it started? No, not a word. He didn't provoke them, Sheriff. They walked right up to his booth. One of them tossed something at the dog, a peanut or something like that. Red didn't even look at them, just kept eating. Across from them, the trucker leaned against the wall near the coat hooks, arms folded. He hadn't taken a seat. His name, no one quite remembered, but he was the kind who passed through enough to be known. Always parked in the corner spot, always paid cash. She's telling it straight, he said. They were itching for trouble. Didn't like that the dog didn't react. I think it spooked them, to be honest. Calloway turned slightly in his direction, and you saw both kicks. Saw the first one from the window. Heard the second dog, didn't growl, didn't bark, just stood there, tight leash and all. But when that second guy kicked him and yanked the leash, everything changed, like a switch flipped. The sheriff nodded again, and Red gave a command. Yeah, Cassie said quickly. Outside, after he came back from paying his bill, he just raised his hand, said one word. Engage, the trucker added. I was halfway out the door when I heard it. Calloway jotted that down too. His handwriting had grown slower over the years, but he didn't miss details. Cassie exhaled. Sharply, they were laughing when they did it. Sheriff, I mean it. Like it was some kind of joke. She paused, rubbing her hand over her apron's hem. It wasn't just disrespect. It was mean, deliberate, like they wanted a reaction. Calloway finally looked up, and they got one. Yeah, the trucker said. But not the kind they wanted. The air inside the diner stilled again, this time without fear, just memory. Everyone had seen something that didn't quite fit the world they thought they understood. A man and his dog? Yes, but not like that. The calmness, the precision, the silence after the storm. Calloway closed his notepad gently, tucking it into the side pocket of his jacket. You two did the right thing. I'll file your statements myself. Won't need you to come down to the station unless something changes. Cassie nodded, looking toward the window. Shadow sat quietly, just outside, near the truck, ears twitching only slightly with the wind. Is that dog always like that? She asked. Calloway followed her gaze. Not always, just when he has to be. He looked down at his radio, then back. Up at them, but you saw what matters. You saw what came first, and that's what's going in the report. Outside, the heat had begun to rise again. It clung low to the pavement in a shimmer, curling the edge of the gas station's shadow. Shadow lay beside Red's truck, breathing slow and steady, ears at half alert but posture relaxed. He hadn't moved since the sheriff told him to stay. The bikers were gone now, loaded into an ambulance under the gaze of 2 deputies who arrived after the fact. More for show than necessity, Sheriff Calloway remained near the truck. Arms crossed, watching Shadow for a long moment before turning to Red. "Still got him certified?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Red didn't speak. He reached into the side compartment of the truck, removed a plain brown folder sealed in a heavy plastic envelope, and handed it over. Calloway took it without a word. The weight was familiar, less in ounces than in implication. He flipped the clasp open and drew out the contents. Pausing to hold up the top page to the sunlight, a Department of Defense emblem marked the upper right corner. Below it, a series of service records, certifications, and deployment orders. The name at the top was formal: Shadow, Military Working Dog. Serial K93F271. Calloway flipped slowly through the documents. Years of activity unfolded in black ink, and typed codes: K9 Handler Evaluations, Unit Commendations, Joint Operation Logs. Red's name appeared more than once. So did places most folks in this corner of the desert never talked about aloud: Fallujah, Kandahar, Al-Taqadem. "You were both in with the 13th Security Forces," Calloway said, scanning a line in one report. Red nodded. "Joint Explosives Detection Detail," the sheriff continued. Red gave a slight sound from his throat. It could have been agreement or memory, possibly both. Calloway turned the page. A photograph was clipped near the back end. Official military shot. Red looked younger then, leaner, sun-weathered, with a serious set to his jaw. Shadow sat beside him, harnessed, a bit thinner, ears upright, mouth slightly open in a pant, but eyes the same unwavering. Another form was marked Combat Incident Review. A commendation noted that Shadow had once intercepted an insurgent attempting to plant an IED near a convoy route. There was a wound listed to left shoulder, deep tissue laceration. Probable cause: shrapnel. The scar above Shadow's right eye, still visible today. Wasn't mentioned in the report, but it didn't have to be. Calloway had seen enough to know where such marks came from. He read through the final page. Certification of retirement. Date: 3 years ago. Signature: Colonel R. Harmon. Comment: MWD Shadow is hereby honorably retired from active service due to age and accumulated service stress. Dogme remain in custody of handler SGTE reading per section 3B-15. Calloway folded the pages back together and slipped them into the envelope, then handed it back. "Still keep his bite certification current?" he asked. Red tapped his temple. "Training doesn't expire here." The sheriff gave a faint nod. "Can't argue that." He looked over at Shadow again, lying silent. Unmoved by the discussion, there's not 5 dogs in the state that could have done what he did today and stopped when told. Calloway said, "Most would have gone too far. Most do." Red didn't say anything. "He's not just trained," the sheriff continued. "He's bonded." The 2 men stood there in silence for another moment, the kind shared between those who've seen more than they've ever explained to anyone else. Calloway finally stepped back. "We're filing the report clean. You won't hear about this again unless one of those idiots gets ambitious and tries to lie." Red tucked the envelope back in the truck. "I doubt they will," he said. "They saw what he is." Calloway looked down at Shadow one more time. The dog didn't flinch, didn't shift, just kept watch. "They sure did," he muttered, and walked back toward his cruiser. Later that afternoon, the footage was pulled from the security camera mounted above Pump 4. The truck stop didn't have a sophisticated system, just one of those older, slightly grainy digital recorders that looped every 48 hours, but it was enough. Sheriff Calloway stood in the manager's office, the small TV screen humming faintly as the timestamp flicked forward, second by second. The camera didn't capture sound, only motion, and the angle was just wide enough to see the edge of the truck, the concrete post where Shadow had been tied, and the 3 bikers moving in and out of frame. The first man, the one in the green vest, was seen approaching with a swagger. He looked over his shoulder, laughed, and nudged the dog with his boot. Shadow didn't react. Then came the man in red, taller, more animated. He mimed something to the others, pointed at the dog again, then bent down to grab at the leash. Another kick landed squarely against the dog's ribs. The dog still didn't respond till the leash was jerked hard. That's when Shadow stood. The moment Red exited the diner, his figure appearing in the upper corner of the frame, the camera caught the gesture, 2 fingers raised, then one word, his mouth forming the clear shape of it, the next 10 seconds. Happened fast, but even the jittery frame rate didn't blur the precision. Shadow moved low and fast, struck behind the knee, then pivoted to engage the second man. No random lunges, no erratic behavior. Each move was direct and surgically clean. The Manager, a quiet woman named Eileen, stood nearby with her arms folded. Dog waited, she said. Didn't move until the man gave the command. Calloway didn't reply. He rewound the tape. Watched the sequence again. An hour earlier, the ambulance crew had picked up the 2 injured bikers and taken brief statements for the record. One said he was leaning down to tie his boot when the dog lunged. The other said they were admiring the animal, being friendly when it turned on them. Their version of events was as rehearsed as it was shallow. No mention of kicks, no mention of yanking the leash, no mention of laughter. Deputy Harlan had been the one to receive the claim from the hospital. They're saying it was unprovoked, he told the sheriff. One of them wants to file charges. Calloway had just shaken his head. Let them, now. With the video evidence playing in real time, there was little left to argue. The actions of the bikers were clearly deliberate. There was no defensive movement from the dog until the second kick and the aggressive tug on the restraint. Even then, there was hesitation, a beat of waiting, as if Shadow was trained to resist until absolutely necessary. And then, only when commanded, Calloway motioned to pause the tape. "Download it," he said. "Label it and archive it." Eileen nodded and started burning the footage to a USB drive. By the time Calloway returned to his cruiser, his report was mentally finished. Witness statements lined up. Footage matched every detail, and the only injuries sustained were a direct result of what could only be called provocation. As he climbed into the driver's seat, he looked across the lot where the truck still sat. Red was seated behind the wheel now, one arm resting on the doorframe. Shadow was in the passenger seat, eyes forward, still alert. No sign of stress, no agitation. Just a dog who had done his job and then settled. The sheriff tapped the edge of his steering wheel, let out a breath, and muttered, "Let them try and spin it." He didn't expect the bikers to follow through with any legal action. Not after the footage made its way to the hospital administrator and their story began to unravel. Still, if they did push, the truth would stand taller than their version ever could. It already had. Cassie sat at the corner table, the one near the window where the sunlight streaked in and faded across the tile floor. Her apron was folded neatly beside her coffee cup, hands resting still. Sheriff Calloway stood across from her, notepad in hand but not writing yet. She looked tired, not from the shift, but from the weight of having seen something and now needing to put it into words, clearly, calmly, without missing a detail. "He didn't touch them," she said. "Red. Not once, not with a word, not with a gesture, not even with a glance, until they were already outside." Calloway nodded for her to go on. "I was pouring a refill at booth 6 when the bikers came in. Loud whole diner got quiet. You remember that? Like the volume just dropped out of the room? And then they saw the dog?" Her voice didn't waver, but her gaze stayed somewhere past the sheriff's shoulder, as though replaying it in her mind. They joked at first, pointed, called him a freakin' guard dog. Threw something at him, peanut or gum, I couldn't tell. But Red never even looked up, just cut into his eggs like they weren't there. Calloway scratched a note on the page. "They kept at it though," she continued. "One of them leaned in too close. Shadow didn't move, not an inch. He just stared straight ahead. Then they laughed and walked out." She took a sip of her coffee. The rim clinked gently against her ring. Red stood up a minute later, paid at the counter. "I remember because I asked if he wanted change. He nodded once, then stepped outside. Didn't look back. He had no clue they were messing with the dog." Calloway looked up. "And when you followed him out, "I didn't at first," she said. "I was wiping the counter when I heard the first bark." That dog hadn't made a single sound the entire time he'd been in here. So yeah, I looked. Then I heard the second noise, kind of a bark and a growl at the same time. That's when I went out. She paused again. They had him cornered. Two of them anyway. One standing with his foot lifted like he was going to kick again. The other, tugging on the leash. Shadow was tight against the truck post. Still didn't move. Not until Red came around the corner, her eyes settled on the sheriff now, direct and unwavering. He gave one word, just one. And then it was like watching a switch flip. "Engage," Calloway said quietly. Cassie nodded. "Yes." He made another mark in his notebook, underlining something twice. "I've waited on Red for years. I've never seen him raise his voice, never seen that dog growl at a soul. Most customers don't even notice them unless they're watching closely." Calloway let the silence settle. The sounds of the diner had returned in soft, familiar waves, the clink of plates, the low murmur of a couple near the jukebox. But the quiet around Cassie's table held its own kind of weight. She leaned forward slightly. "I don't know what they're going to say happened, Sheriff, but I saw it with my own eyes. That man sat, ate his food, and left. That dog didn't move unless told. And the only thing they both did wrong was not respond to a bunch of cowards trying to start something." Calloway nodded once, closing the notepad. "That's what I needed to hear," he said. Cassie gave a tired smile, stood slowly, and reached for her apron. "That's what happened," she said. Simple as that. The security monitor in the back of the diner was a relic from another decade. Mounted crooked on a wall shelf, its plastic casing was yellowed with age, and a low buzz hummed constantly beneath the grainy black and white footage. Sheriff Calloway stood with his arms crossed as the diner's manager, Eileen, used a remote with missing buttons to rewind the feed to just before 7 that morning. The footage didn't include sound. It didn't need to dot the camera over the entrance angled, just far enough to catch the front windows and part of the lot where Red had parked. His truck appeared in the corner of the frame, parked near the end, where the sun hadn't yet reached the pavement. Shadow was barely visible at first, tied to the metal support beam with his harness taut, seated, still. The timestamp rolled forward, and the first biker came into view, swaggering past Pump 3. He paused near the dog. A slight motion, his leg lifting. A quick jab. It wasn't a gentle nudge. The playback speed made it more obvious. Calloway narrowed his eyes. The man didn't look like he expected a reaction. He looked like he wanted one. Shadow didn't move. The second biker entered next, taller, wearing the red jacket with the large patch across the back. He pointed at the dog, turned to the others, and mimicked something, a kick, maybe a bark. The other two laughed. Then came the second kick. This one was harder, square to the ribs. The frame jolted slightly with the motion. Still, the dog remained seated, restrained, unflinching. The biker grabbed the leash and pulled. It was a quick, aggressive yank that made Shadow's front paws shift to keep balance. Even in low resolution, the tension in the leash was clear. That's when Shadow stood, not lunging, just rising to his feet, shoulders tense, eyes locked. Red stepped out of the diner seconds later. His figure moved across the frame slowly, not running, not rushing, just calm, controlled. He stopped, turned toward the bikers and the dog, and then lifted 2 fingers. His mouth formed one word. The camera was too old to capture detail, but the timing aligned perfectly with every witness account. The dog launched not in a wild burst, but in a tactical lunge, first behind the knee, then a pivot. The sequence was almost too fast to follow in real time. Eileen rewound it again and slowed the speed, frame by frame. Each move was exact. Each target isolated, no panic, no missteps. The third biker ran. The footage caught him mid-step, half a turn toward his motorcycle. Shadow moved to intercept. He didn't bite, just blocked, body low, growl visible in the vibration of his throat. Then Red said something again. One word, maybe 2. Hold, according to the statements. Shadow stopped. The final image was that of the dog standing guard between the biker and his escape, unmoving. The 2 downed men writhed on the pavement, clutching knees and forearms. Red stood near the truck, silent. Calloway motioned for the playback to stop. The room went quiet again, aside from the soft hum of the monitor. Eileen turned to him, waiting. "All we need," he said, "make a copy. I'll take one with me and leave one in the office. Keep it locked." "You think they'll come back?" she asked. Calloway shook his head. "Not after seeing this." He turned to leave, but paused in the doorway and looked back at the frozen frame on the screen shadow. Perfectly still, 1 foot ahead of the other in a textbook canine stance, his gaze locked forward. He was trained for something most people can't even imagine, Calloway said, and he remembered every second of it. Eileen didn't respond. She just hit the button to burn the clip to disk. In that quiet diner, under that old monitor and soft fluorescent light, everything the town needed to know was already captured frame by frame. The late morning sun had shifted high enough to paint long, sharp shadows across the gravel lot. The ambulance had already come and gone, bandaging wounds and muttering questions, but no citations had been written. Not yet. The sheriff's cruiser remained parked sideways near the edge of the diner's lot, forming a quiet blockade between the bikers and their machines. Sheriff Calloway stood with his hat tucked under one arm and a folded notepad in the other, looking squarely at the biker in red. The man shifted uncomfortably, clutching his bruised arm in a makeshift sling and avoiding direct eye contact. Two companions weren't faring much better. One sat on the curb, cradling his knee, rocking slightly. The other leaned against his bike, a bandage already spotted with fresh blood at the elbow. All three now looked smaller than when they'd rolled in earlier that morning with roaring engines and loud laughter. Calloway didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I'm not writing anything today," he said evenly. "Not because I don't have cause, but because you three already wrote your own consequences." The man in red opened his mouth, but the sheriff lifted one hand, not in warning, but in a quiet command to let him finish. "You kicked a restrained dog, twice yanked on his leash, cornered him, laughed about it, and you did it while his handler was inside paying for eggs." The wind kicked up dust, scraping it low across the lot. No one spoke. "That dog," Calloway continued, nodding toward the truck where Shadow now sat calmly in the front passenger seat, "has more discipline than any man I've met in uniform or out. He waited, he took it. He didn't move until he was told to. That restraint, that's training, that's trust. And you're lucky he had better judgment than you." The biker in red looked away, his jaw clenched, then relaxed again. "I got 3 statements that line up perfectly," Calloway said. "2 witnesses who saw everything from the window, a video feed that leaves nothing to the imagination, and a military canine file sitting in my cruiser that reads like a service medal list." He stepped closer now, just a few feet from the biker. "I wanted to push it. I could charge you with attempted animal cruelty, assault, and provoking a service animal during lawful control. But I'm not." The biker looked up. "Why not?" Calloway let the question sit. "Because you're already bruised, you're embarrassed, and you've been reminded very publicly that not everything in the desert is yours to toy with." His voice hardened slightly. "Leave now, and let this be the last time your boots touch the gravel in this town. You're not welcome back." The man nodded once, slow, without pride. The others followed without a word, limping or dragging their heels toward their bikes. The engine started quieter this time. No revving, no theatrics. Just the dull rumble of men who had learned a line they hadn't seen coming. Calloway watched them go, hands on his hips, hat still tucked under one arm, as the bikes disappeared. Down the highway, he finally turned toward the truck. Red hadn't moved from the front seat. He was sipping from a thermos now, watching the lot with the calm of a man who had seen worse and expected more. Shadow, beside him, blinked once and looked away. Calloway walked over slowly and leaned in at the open window. "Handled clean," he said. "Didn't want it, just responded." The sheriff tapped the edge of the window frame with his knuckles. "I'll file the report with a note, resolved on scene. That good?" Red didn't smile, but something eased in his eyes. "Good," he said, then added, "Thanks." Calloway straightened, placed his hat back on his head, and started back toward his cruiser. The heat was rising now, humming off the pavement, and the town had already begun to return to its usual quiet rhythm, except for the empty spot by Pump 3, the dust still settling where the bikes had been. It started with a paper bag of jerky. No note, just left neatly beside the tire of Red's truck as the sun dipped low behind the hills. Red saw it when he came out of the diner late that evening, the last to leave. He picked it up without a word, sniffed the contents real meat, high quality, and handed a strip to Shadow, who took it gently and waited for the rest. The next morning, there was a small plastic container of sliced chicken. Later that week, someone placed a dog brush in a sealed Ziploc, tied with a ribbon. By Thursday, a folded American flag bandana had been laid across the hood. No one admitted to it, not at first, but the gestures grew more frequent, and it didn't take long for the rhythm of the town to shift ever so slightly. Where Red once sat alone in the far booth, a few regulars began nodding in his direction as they passed. Some paused to ask if Shadow needed anything. Others simply gave a small wave and moved on. A quiet acknowledgement passed from one neighbor to another. Cassie noticed it when she came into work early the next Monday. Someone had placed a stainless steel dog bowl near the outdoor bench, clean, filled with water. No explanation. By the end of the week, there were 2 bowls. It wasn't just the diner. The hardware store left a bone-shaped toy on the counter, wrapped in brown paper with the receipt still tucked inside. The gas station attendant offered Red a free coffee when he came in for diesel. On the house, he said, for the one that kept it from getting ugly. No one brought up the bikers. Not directly, but everyone had heard. Word traveled fast in small places, especially when justice came without paperwork. The video footage hadn't made it online. Eileen had made sure of that, but the story spread anywhere he told over counters and church pews and the dusty chairs of the barber shop, where the floor was always speckled with gray clippings and unsaid things. They kicked the dog, folks said. That was enough. Some were surprised the sheriff hadn't hauled the men off. Others weren't. Sheriff Calloway had always had his own sense of order. Firm but measured, slow-moving but grounded in old rules. And Red had earned the benefit of the doubt long ago, though most folks couldn't quite remember when or how. Only that he had always been there, silent, constant. Now they understood more, or at least they respected it. Children began asking to see Shadow. A few drew crayon pictures that Cassie taped to the diner's wall. One little girl brought a jar of peanut butter treats and stood shyly by the truck until Red nodded once. Shadow stepped forward, took the treat without bark or fanfare, and sat back down. The girl beamed. Red never spoke much, but when thanked, he tipped his hat or muttered something low enough it barely cleared the wind. Shadow became the talking point, the thread people used to speak without really having to say anything uncomfortable. They talked about his posture, his eyes, the way he didn't bark unless needed. They asked what kind of training he'd had. Some wondered aloud if the dog remembered things no one else ever would. By month's end, the bench near the truck had become a resting spot for passersby. Sometimes Red joined them, sometimes not. But Shadow was always there, watching, listening. The town never threw a parade. No formal recognition, no plaques or newspaper write-ups, just a steady ripple of quiet action. Things left, favors done, space made. Shadow didn't change. Red didn't either, but the town did. Just enough. The black SUV rolled into the diner lot mid-morning, its tinted windows glossy under the desert sun. It didn't belong to anyone from town. That was clear from the moment it passed the faded mile marker 73 sign and slowed near the bench, where Red's truck usually parked. The vehicle was clean to clean for the grit and whereof the Mojave's wind. Government plates. Federal red. He was seated inside the diner with his coffee, same as always. Shadow lay under the table, ears forward, body relaxed but aware. Cassie poured another cup without asking. "Friend of yours?" she asked quietly, eyes on the vehicle. "Not exactly." Red muttered. The door opened, and a woman in a dark pantsuit stepped out. Mid-40s, straight posture, shoulder-length black hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore no visible badge, but she didn't need one. She had the presence of someone used to being listened to. She paused just outside the SUV, adjusted her sunglasses, then walked directly toward the diner entrance. Inside, conversations quieted. Even those who hadn't noticed the SUV now turned, sensing something formal about her gait. She opened the door with the kind of precision that spoke of habit, not hesitation. Her eyes scanned the room once before landing on Red. She approached without pause. "Mr. Kessler," she said softly, respectful. Red didn't correct her. He just nodded once, then gestured to the booth across from him. She took the seat, placed a small black folder on the table, but didn't open it. Shadow remained still. "I'm Agent Lorraine Marks, Department of Defense, K9 Historical Services. Unit." Red said nothing, but his eyebrows lifted a fraction. "We monitor the service records of retired military working dogs and their handlers," she continued. "Occasionally, a situation comes up where we get flagged." Cassie walked by with a fresh pot, but Agent Marks waved it off politely. Red reached down, rested a hand lightly on Shadow's back. The dog's breathing didn't change. "Yesterday, we received a copy of a video from a highway camera not from this diner, but a nearby highway patrol dashcam. It caught the tail end of an incident out front." Still, Red didn't speak. "Dog," she said, looking down briefly before continuing, "acted with complete control. Controlled aggression, coordinated defensive behavior. Every move matched protocol." It raised a few eyebrows. Finally, Red spoke. "So what's the problem?" "No problem," she said, smiling faintly. "That's the point." She opened the black folder. Inside was a page with Shadow's name, service ID, deployment records, and recertification history. Everything stamped, filed, and up to date. "You've maintained his status. Most don't. They retire these dogs, let the skills go. But not you. You kept him sharp." Red gave a small nod. He remembers she glanced down at Shadow. "He does more." Then remember, they sat in silence for a beat. Marks closed the folder and slid it back into her coat. "There's no official review, no inquiry. I'm here off record. I just wanted to see for myself." Red looked at her, finally studying her face. "You were a handler," he said. Was she replied, "Fallujah, K9 Unit Echo 5, lost mine to a sniper." Red nodded once. Deeper this time, she looked down at Shadow again. He met her eyes with the calm, unblinking focus of an animal trained to protect without question. Her voice softened. "I just needed to see it again, what it looks like when it all works." Then she stood, smoothing her jacket. "You take care of each other." She left without waiting for a response. No business card, no warnings, just a quiet nod as she passed Cassie, who stood at the end of the counter holding 2 mugs and watching. Closely, the black SUV pulled away just as silently as it had arrived. Dust kicked up briefly, then settled back inside. Red sipped his coffee. Shadow remained under the table. Everything for now stayed just as it was. The call came late, long after the diner had closed and the desert had gone still. Sheriff Calloway was home, half asleep in his recliner, TV murmuring low in the background. The phone rang only once before he picked up. No one else ever called. That line anymore not, unless it mattered. He listened without speaking, his fingers tapping the armrest slowly as the voice on the other end spoke in clipped formal tones. When it ended, he simply said, "Understood," and hung up. He didn't move for a while after that, just stared at the blank screen of the now muted television, the silence pressing in. 2 towns over, a Department of Defense liaison logged into a restricted system and reopened a file that hadn't been touched in years. The clearance level was high, and the digital log was encrypted. At the top, the subject name read, K9 Tactical Unit Shadow. Serial hashtag K93-01182. The contents were clean and thorough deployment history across multiple zones, both foreign and domestic. Handler credentials, recertification exams, real training footage, and evaluation reports stamped from 4 different branches. A note in red from 3 years ago. Handler requests full civilian retirement. Status granted. Now a new flag had been added. Observed field response under duress. Controlled engagement. Subject retains full tactical functionality. Consider for reserve consult status. Hold for tier for internal review. No names were attached to that last note. The file wasn't reassigned. Not yet. It wasn't even pulled into active circulation. But it was no longer dormant. At the truck stop diner, Red felt the shift without needing confirmation. It was in the way the wind pressed harder against the windows that night. Or maybe in how Shadow sat a little straighter near the truck when dusk fell. Not tense, just prepared. They didn't speak of it. They never did. But the old rhythms returned with a certain quiet certainty. In the weeks that followed, A few things changed. A black SUV passed through again, this time not stopping, just a slow crawl through the lot before disappearing down the road. A different set of plates, a different driver. Same feeling that mail brought an envelope marked unclassified, but with the return address blacked out. Inside, a form titled Readiness Check, Civilian Retained Asset. Nothing required, just a list of procedures. Health check, training, updates, emergency contact verification. Red folded the sheet once, placed it in the glove box beneath a worn leather pouch he hadn't opened in years. He noticed Shadow watching him, tail still, ears forward. Not a single bark since the incident. That part hadn't changed. Later that night, Red took the dog out behind the trailer and gave a single hand signal. No words, just a flat palm raised, then dropped. Shadow moved, instantly circling, flanking, stopping on command without hesitation. Red watched for a long time. When he finally turned to go back inside, he said only, "Still got it." And Shadow sat, waiting for the next cue. People in town didn't know. Not exactly, but they noticed the difference. The way Red now checked. The horizon a little more often. How he sometimes walked Shadow along the perimeter of the diner before sunrise, eyes scanning the road. How the dog's harness had changed now with a new strap. Something reinforced, something worn from use, but cleanly reattached. It was all unspoken. But it was understood. Shadow's file might have been reopened in a federal system. But the real activation wasn't digital. It was in the air, the pacing, the posture. A quiet readiness returned. Not for revenge, not for ceremony, but for possibility. No orders had come. None were needed. They were listening again. Somewhere, someone was watching, and Shadow was ready. The three bikers left just after sundown, their engines quieter than when they'd arrived. One had a bandaged arm wrapped in gauze and duct tape. Another limped slightly as he climbed onto his bike. The man in the red leather jacket didn't speak much, not even to his companions. He stared at the horizon for a long moment before lowering his visor and rolling out Dot. No one stopped them. Sheriff Calloway watched from the porch of the diner with his arms crossed, radio still crackling. At his hip, he didn't wave, just nodded once as they passed, the way men sometimes do when no words are needed. The townspeople said nothing either. A few lingered outside the gas station, pretending to check tires or fuel levels, eyes hidden behind sunglasses, even though the sun had already dipped below the ridge. They didn't shout or jeer, no smug grins or parting insults. Just a strange kind of silence, heavy but respectful, like the ending of something no one wanted to name. There were no charges filed, no reports submitted. The sheriff had made that clear early on. They kicked the dog, he said, as if that explained everything. And in this town, it did. The bikers never returned. Not the next week, not the month after. They didn't stop at neighboring exits or swing by for gas on their way to Vegas. It was as if the road had bent around mile marker 73, like the map had changed when no one was looking. People speculated. A few thought maybe they'd learned something. Others figured it was shame or maybe just fear. But deep down, most understood it wasn't just about the dog. Not really. It was about what happened when a line was crossed, one that didn't need signs or warnings or fences. Just a scarred German shepherd and an old man who didn't raise his voice. Red never mentioned them again. Shadow didn't change, not outwardly. But the rhythm of the days shifted in subtle ways. The morning walks were a little longer, the eyes behind the counter a little kinder. The town, without realizing it, had adjusted. Cassie stopped putting the dog bowls away at night. She just left them out by the bench, trusting no one would touch them. They did one morning. A man named Tucker, who ran the local tow service, dropped off a bag of fresh meat scraps wrapped in butcher paper. He didn't say who it was for, but he left it in Red's cooler anyway. Just extra, he said. It. The church. Pastor Ron mentioned the incident once, not by name, but in the way he phrased his sermon. Sometimes mercy doesn't look like forgiveness. It looks like restraint. A few nodded more than usual that morning. Red stayed quiet, but even he seemed to move a little easier. Not relaxed, but less watchful. As if some internal weight had been acknowledged, even if it hadn't lifted. Presence. He didn't seek out attention, but when it came through the cautious hand of a child or the reverent distance of a passerby, he accepted it with dignity. No barking, no tail wagging. Just quiet observation. Over time, the story turned into something else. Not a tale of violence or justice, but of boundary, of warning, a reminder that in a world filled with noise, there was still a place where silence carried weight. They never came back. No angry phone calls, no revenge. No escalation, just the sound of tires rolling into the distance, never to return. And in their absence, something else settled in a kind of peace, not loud or celebrated, but earned. The town had its rhythm back, and Shadow watched it all scarred, still and unwavering. The light through the diner window always came in at the same angle around 7:45 a.m. It cut across the red vinyl of the booths and left a warm square on the tile floor where the sun took its time settling. That morning was no different. Cassie poured the first pot of coffee and glanced out, already knowing what she'd see. Red's truck was parked in its usual spot, same dust coating the fenders, same dented front bumper from an incident no one ever talked about. The passenger door creaked open, and Shadow hopped down before Red even stepped out. The dog landed with silent precision, ears twitching toward the horizon before settling into a slow walk toward the entrance. Red followed behind with his familiar limp, slower these days but no less steady. They moved like one rhythm, like something rehearsed but never staged. The bell over the door gave its soft chime. No one turned to look. They didn't have to. Chose the same booth near the corner, the one with a partial view of both the front lot and the kitchen door. He slid into the seat with a slow exhale, the kind of breath that said nothing had changed but everything had been acknowledged. Shadow sat beside him, not under the table but facing outward, spine straight, eyes alert but unbothered. The leash was looped around Red's wrist, but there was no tension in it. It was more habit than Tooland, old routine left in place out of quiet respect rather than need. Cassie approached with a fresh mug and a knowing smile. Coffee. Red gave a single nod, black. She poured without comment. There wasn't much to say anymore. A few booths down, a young couple with a toddler looked over. The child pointed at Shadow, and the dog tilted his head just slightly, watching but not reacting. The mother whispered something and pulled the boy gently back. No fear, just caution. On Shadow's back, the dog didn't flinch, just leaned into it slightly. Outside, the wind blew dust across the parking lot. A paper cup rolled past the gas pumps and got caught against the curb. The town had gone back to its usual rhythm, slow, unremarkable, but not untouched. People still talked, now and then. Not loudly, not in groups, just in passing, when the right moment came. About what happened, about what didn't happen, about what could have happened, and about how one word, engage, had changed the story. There were no new signs posted, no plaques or news stories, just quiet memory, preserved by those who witnessed it. Red didn't bring it up, he never did, but some mornings he'd sit a little longer, letting the coffee grow cold as Shadow kept his eyes on the door. And on one of those mornings, a man from out of town walked in business suit, rental car, unfamiliar face. He gave Red a glance, then the dog, then moved on. But he walked differently on the way out, slower, more aware, as if the air itself reminded him not to assume too much. Cassie noticed, but she didn't say anything. Time passed the way it always did. Trucks came and went. Locals filled their tanks and shared brief nods over coffee. The same songs played low from the jukebox near the restrooms. And Red and Shadow remained fixtures now, like the worn linoleum or the scratched napkin holders. Always there. Always quiet. Some things didn't need to be declared. The leash stayed on. But everyone knew it wasn't necessary. It wasn't about control. It was about presence, and presence here meant everything.